On a quiet, misty evening in a small village nestled between the dense forests of Hokkaido, the air was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of pine. The old house, abandoned for years, stood as a silent sentinel at the edge of the village, its wooden structure creaking with age and neglect. The overgrown garden was a wild tangle of weeds and vines, choking the once superb cherry blossom trees that lined the path to the front porch. The house had a reputation, whispered among the villagers, of being haunted by a spirit known as the porch light phantom. Its dim, flickering light was said to appear sporadically, casting an eerie glow on the decrepit porch, drawing the curious and the foolish alike. Kazuki, a young man in his early 30s, had returned to his childhood village after many years in Tokyo. The hustle and bustle of city life had worn him down, and he sought solace in the familiar, tranquil surroundings of his youth. Accompanying him was his wife, Eiko, a quiet woman with a keen sense of curiosity and a penchant for the supernatural. They had heard the stories, of course, but dismissed them as mere folklore, the fanciful imaginings of a superstitious village. One evening, as they strolled hand in hand along the village's winding paths, they found themselves drawn to the old house. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to twinkle in the deepening twilight. The air grew cooler, and a light fog began to roll in from the forest, shrouding the village in an ethereal veil. As they approached the house, Kazuki noticed the faint glow of the porch light, flickering like a distant firefly. Eiko, intrigued, suggested they take a closer look. Kazuki hesitated, a chill running down his spine, but his wife's enthusiasm was infectious. Together, they stepped onto the creaking wooden porch, the boards groaning under their weight. The light flickered again, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Eiko reached out to touch the light, but as her fingers brushed against it, the glow vanished, plunging them into darkness. Kazuki felt a surge of fear, his heart pounding in his chest, but Eiko's calm demeanor steadied him. She suggested they explore the house, convinced that the light was merely a trick of the old wiring. Reluctantly, Kazuki agreed, and they pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned in protest. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. Dust motes floated in the beams of their flashlights, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. They moved from room to room, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Each room told a story of its own, from the faded photographs on the walls to the tattered furniture covered in dust sheets. In one room, they found an old piano, its keys yellowed and silent, a ghost of music long forgotten. In another, a bookshelf filled with ancient tomes, their pages brittle and yellowed with age. As they made their way upstairs, the sense of unease grew stronger. Kazuki couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the house itself was alive, aware of their presence. Eiko, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, her curiosity driving her forward. At the end of the hallway, they found a door slightly ajar, a faint light seeping through the crack. Kazuki's breath caught in his throat as he pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth as if moved by an unseen hand. Eiko stepped forward, her eyes wide with fascination. But Kazuki held her back, a sense of dread washing over him. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Kazuki's flashlight sputtered and died, leaving them in complete blackness. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling, and managed to turn on the flashlight. In the beam of light, they saw the rocking chair, now still, and a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadows. Kazuki's heart raced as he backed away, pulling Eiko with him. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and Kazuki felt a scream rising in his throat. But before he could utter a sound, the figure vanished, leaving them alone in the dark, silent room. Breathing heavily, Kazuki and Eiko hurried down the stairs and out of the house, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Once outside, they paused to catch their breath. The cold night air, a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Kazuki looked back at the house, its dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. He knew they had to leave to get as far away from the haunted place as possible. But something in Aiko's expression gave him pause. She seemed different, her eyes shining with a strange light, and he felt a shiver of fear. That night, as they lay in bed, Kazuki couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them from the house, a presence lurking in the shadows. He glanced at Aiko, her face serene in the moonlight, and wondered what she had seen in that room, what had changed within her. As sleep finally claimed him, he dreamt of the porch light, flickering in the darkness, and the figure standing in the shadows, waiting, watching. The next day, Kazuki and Aiko decided to leave the village, their bags packed and ready by the door. But as they prepared to leave, Aiko hesitated, her eyes drawn to the old house at the edge of the village. Kazuki, sensing her reluctance, tried to reassure her, but she seemed distant, her thoughts elsewhere. They left the village behind, the old house a fading memory in the rearview mirror. But Kazuki couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with the porch light phantom was far from over. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Kazuki would wake in the middle of the night to find Aiko standing by the window, staring out at the darkness. She would mumble in her sleep, speaking in a voice that was not her own, and he would hear the faint, distant sound of a rocking chair creaking. One night, he woke to find her gone, the front door wide open, and the porch light flickering in the darkness. Panic surged through him as he searched the house, calling her name, but there was no response. Finally, he found her on the porch, standing in the cold night air, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the old house. He pulled her back inside, his heart pounding with fear, and she seemed to snap out of her trance, looking at him with confusion. In the days that followed, Kazuki became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the porch light phantom had somehow attached itself to them, haunting their every step. He began to research the history of the house, uncovering a dark tale of betrayal and murder that had left a lingering stain on the village. The house had once belonged to a wealthy merchant who had been betrayed by his closest friend and left to die on the porch, his spirit forever bound to the place of his demise. Kazuki realized that they had awakened the spirit, and now it sought revenge, using Aiko as its vessel. Desperate, he sought the help of a local priest who performed a purification ritual on their home. But the strange occurrences only intensified. Kazuki knew they had to return to the house to confront the spirit and put an end to the haunting once and for all. Armed with a resolve born of desperation, they returned to the village, to the old house that had become the source of their nightmares. As they stepped onto the porch, the light flickered once more, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. Kazuki took Aiko's hand, his grip firm, and together they pushed open the door, ready to face whatever awaited them inside. In the dim light of the hallway, they saw the rocking chair, still and silent, and the faint outline of the figure in the corner. Kazuki felt a surge of fear, but he pushed it aside, determined to save his wife and rid themselves of the ghostly presence. With a deep breath, they stepped forward into the darkness, into the unknown, to confront the porch light phantom and end the haunting that had turned their lives into a living nightmare. Kazuki and Aiko stood at the entrance of the old house, their breath visible in the cold night air. The porch light flickered once more, casting eerie shadows across their faces. Kazuki tightened his grip on Aiko's hand, his determination bolstered by the fear in her eyes. They stepped inside, the door creaking loudly as it closed behind them. The musty scent of decay and abandonment filled their nostrils, and the silence was oppressive. Kazuki switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the dust-covered furniture and peeling wallpaper. Their footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as they moved cautiously forward. Kazuki couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the house itself was alive and aware of their presence. "Aiko," ever the skeptic, seemed more curious than frightened. She led the way, her eyes scanning every corner, searching for the source of the haunting. They reached the base of the staircase, the old wood creaking under their weight as they ascended. Each step seemed to resonate with a sense of foreboding, as if the house were warning them to turn back. At the top of the stairs, they paused, their breaths shallow and rapid. Kazuki's flashlight flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Ahead of them, the door to the small room where they had first encountered the figure stood slightly ajar. A faint light seeping through the crack, Kazuki felt a chill run down his spine as he pushed the door open. The rocking chair was still, bathed in the dim light from an unseen source. The figure in the corner, however, was gone. Kazuki and Eiko stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Kazuki's flashlight sputtered and died, leaving them in complete blackness. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling, and managed to turn on the flashlight app. In the beam of light, they saw the rocking chair, now gently swaying back and forth, as if moved by an unseen hand. Kazuki's heart raced as he backed away, pulling Eiko with him. A cold breeze seemed to flow through the room, carrying with it a whisper of voices, faint and unintelligible. Eiko's eyes widened as she clutched Kazuki's arm, her face pale with fear. Kazuki felt a surge of protectiveness and fear, his mind racing with thoughts of how to escape this nightmare. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the empty house. Kazuki rushed to the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. Eiko, her voice trembling, suggested they look for another way out. They turned back to the room, their flashlights illuminating the shadows as they searched for an exit. In the corner, where the figure had once stood, Kazuki noticed a small trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. He knelt down, pulling the rug aside to reveal the door. With a sense of urgency, he pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the unknown. Kazuki and Eiko exchanged a glance, their fear palpable. But they knew they had no other choice. They descended the stairs, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The narrow passageway seemed to close in around them, the walls rough and uneven. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dank cellar. The walls were lined with old shelves, filled with dusty jars and broken tools. In the center of the room stood a large wooden chest, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Kazuki approached the chest, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached out to open it, a cold hand grasped his wrist. Stopping him in his tracks, he turned, his flashlight illuminating the face of an old woman, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. Kazuki stumbled back, pulling Eiko with him. The old woman spoke in a voice that seemed to echo through the cellar, her words filled with a sense of despair. "You should not have come here," she said, her eyes boring into Kazuki's. "This place is cursed, and now you are part of it." Kazuki felt a surge of fear and confusion as the old woman stepped back, her form fading into the shadows. He turned back to the chest, his mind racing with questions. What was the curse she spoke of? And how were they part of it? With a sense of determination, he opened the chest, revealing its contents. Inside, he found an old diary, its pages yellowed with age. He opened it, his flashlight illuminating the faded handwriting. The diary belonged to the merchant, who had once owned the house, and it detailed his betrayal and murder. Kazuki read the entries, his heart sinking as he realized the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded in the house. The merchant had been betrayed by his closest friend, who had coveted his wealth and position. In a fit of rage and jealousy, the friend had murdered the merchant, leaving his body on the porch to be discovered by the villagers. The merchant's spirit, filled with anger and a desire for revenge, had been bound to the house, haunting it ever since. Kazuki felt a chill run down his spine as he read the final entry. Written in a shaky hand, "I will not rest until my killer is brought to justice," the entry read. "My spirit will haunt this house, and all who enter it, until my revenge is complete." Kazuki closed the diary, his mind racing with thoughts of how to break the curse. He knew they had to find a way to bring the merchant's killer to justice, to free his spirit from its torment. As they ascended the stairs, Kazuki and Eiko felt a renewed sense of determination. They would uncover the truth and put an end to the haunting once and for all. Back in the village, they sought out the oldest residents, hoping to find someone who remembered the events of that fateful night. They spoke to a woman named Yuki, who had lived in the village her entire life. She remembered the merchant and his betrayal, and she told them of a hidden room in the house, where the merchant's killer had hidden his ill-gotten gains. Kazuki and Eiko returned to the house, their resolve strengthened by Yuki's words. They searched the house, their flashlights illuminating the shadows as they moved from room to room. Finally, in the basement, they found a hidden door, concealed behind a false wall. Inside, they found the treasure, still intact, and the skeletal remains of the merchant's killer. Kazuki felt a surge of triumph. As he realized they had found the key to breaking the curse, they took the treasure and the remains to the village. Presenting them to the priest, he performed a purification ritual, and the spirit of the merchant was finally freed. Kazuki and Eiko felt a sense of relief and closure as they watched the house, its windows now dark and empty, the porch light no longer flickering. They knew the haunting was over, and they could finally move on with their lives. But as they turned to leave, Kazuki glanced back at the house, and for a moment he thought he saw the figure of the old woman watching them from the shadows. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, and walked away, his hand tightly clasped in Eiko's. As they left the village, they felt a sense of peace and renewal. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious, and they knew they would never forget the lessons they had learned. The porch light phantom was no more, and the village could finally rest in peace. The night was unusually quiet as Kazuki and Eiko sat in their small, candlelit living room, poring over the old diary they had found in the haunted house. The wind outside whispered through the trees, a haunting melody that seemed to echo the despair and anger within the pages. The soft flicker of the candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, adding to the already tense atmosphere. Kazuki's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, each entry revealing more about the tragic past of the merchant and his betrayal. Eiko, sitting close beside him, read aloud the words written in a spidery, aged script. The merchant was a kind man, beloved by the villagers. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. But his success bred envy in the heart of his closest friend, Takashi. Takashi, consumed by jealousy, plotted to take everything the merchant had. Kazuki's mind raced as he listened, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The merchant's spirit was bound to the house, seeking justice for the betrayal and murder that had left him restless in the afterlife. "We have to find Takashi's descendants," Kazuki said, his voice filled with determination. "They are the key to breaking the curse and freeing the merchant's spirit." Eiko nodded, her expression resolute. They had to act quickly before the haunting took a more sinister turn. The next morning, they set out to gather information about Takashi's descendants. Their first stop was the village's small, ancient library, where they hoped to find records and documents that could lead them to the present-day family. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Sato, was more than willing to help. She led them to a dusty corner of the library, where old records were kept, pulling out a large, leather-bound book filled with the village's history. Kazuki and Eiko pored over the records, searching for any mention of Takashi and his family. Hours passed, and their hope began to wane, until Eiko stumbled upon a small entry detailing Takashi's lineage. "Here it is," she said excitedly, pointing to a name in the book. "Takashi's grandson Hiroshi still lives in the neighboring town." Kazuki felt a surge of relief and anticipation. They had a lead. They thanked Mrs. Sato and left the library, determined to find Hiroshi and uncover the truth. The drive to the neighboring town was filled with a tense silence. Both of them lost in their thoughts. Kazuki's mind was racing with questions and scenarios, while Aiko's expression was one of grim determination. When they arrived, they wasted no time in locating Hiroshi's house, a modest, well-kept home on the outskirts of town. Kazuki knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered face. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gentle but curious. Kazuki and Aiko introduced themselves and explained their purpose, recounting the tragic story of the merchant and Takashi's betrayal. Hiroshi listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "I've heard the stories," he said finally, his voice tinged with sadness. "My grandfather was a man consumed by jealousy and greed. I always suspected there was more to the story." Kazuki and Aiko shared the details of their encounter with the porch light phantom and their discovery of the diary. Hiroshi's eyes widened as he listened, a mix of fear and understanding crossing his face. "We need your help to put an end to this," Kazuki said, his voice earnest. "The merchant's spirit won't rest until justice is served." Hiroshi nodded slowly, his expression resolute. "I will help you," he said firmly. "My family has carried this burden for too long. It's time to make amends." Together, they returned to the village and the old house, the air heavy with anticipation. As they approached the house, the porch light flickered once more, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with a malevolent intent. Kazuki, Aiko, and Hiroshi stood before the house, their faces set with determination. They knew this was their only chance to put an end to the haunting and free the merchant's spirit. They entered the house, the air inside cold and oppressive. Kazuki led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they made their way to the small room where they had first encountered the figure. The rocking chair was still, bathed in the dim light from an unseen source. Kazuki's heart raced as he approached the chair, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. Hiroshi stepped forward, his voice steady as he spoke to the empty room. "I am Hiroshi, the grandson of Takashi. I know of the betrayal and the wrongs committed against you. We are here to make amends and seek your forgiveness." The air grew colder, and a faint, whispering voice seemed to echo through the room. Kazuki felt a chill run down his spine as the figure of the old woman appeared once more, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. "You seek forgiveness," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "But the pain and betrayal cannot be undone so easily." Hiroshi stepped closer, his expression one of genuine remorse. "My grandfather's actions were unforgivable, but we want to set things right. Please, tell us how we can help you find peace." The old woman gazed at Hiroshi for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice filled with a weary sadness. "The treasure must be returned to its rightful place, and the truth of my death must be known to all. Only then can my spirit find rest." Kazuki and Aiko exchanged a glance, their resolve strengthened by the old woman's words. They had found the treasure in the hidden room, and now they had to return it and reveal the truth. With Hiroshi's help, they carefully transported the treasure back to the village. Presenting it to the village council, the story of the merchant's betrayal and murder was told, and the village finally learned the truth. As the treasure was placed in the village shrine, a sense of peace seemed to settle over the village. Kazuki and Aiko returned to the house, the air feeling lighter and the oppressive atmosphere gone. The porch light no longer flickered, and the house seemed to have lost its malevolent presence. In the small room, the figure of the old woman appeared once more, her eyes filled with a serene peace. "Thank you," she said softly, her form slowly fading into the shadows. Kazuki and Aiko watched as she disappeared, a sense of closure and relief washing over them. Hiroshi, standing beside them, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The curse was broken, and the spirit was finally at peace. As they left the house for the last time, the sun began to rise. casting a warm, golden light over the village. Kazuki and Eiko felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose, knowing they had helped to right a terrible wrong. They knew the village would never forget the story of the merchant and the porch light phantom, but now it could move forward, free from the haunting that had plagued it for so long. As they drove away, Kazuki glanced back at the house one last time, a sense of peace settling over him. The porch light phantom was no more, and the village could finally rest in peace. Their journey had been filled with fear and uncertainty, but they had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. They knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had faced the haunting of the porch light phantom. The village too would move forward, its people carrying the lessons of the past with them, but no longer haunted by the shadows of betrayal and revenge. The chill of the early morning air seemed to penetrate deep into their bones. As Kazuki, Eiko, and Hiroshi stood before the old house, the porch light, once a malevolent beacon, now lay dormant. But the sense of foreboding remained. Kazuki glanced at Eiko, her determined expression mirroring his own resolve. They had come too far to turn back now. They entered the house, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The interior was shrouded in darkness, but there was an unmistakable presence, a palpable tension that made the hair on the back of Kazuki's neck stand on end. They moved cautiously through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. In the small room where they had first encountered the spirit, the air was thick with an oppressive energy. Kazuki felt his heart race as they approached the rocking chair, now still and silent. The figure of the old woman, the merchant's spirit, appeared once more, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "You have done well to bring the treasure back and reveal the truth," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "But there is still one final task that must be completed." Kazuki felt a chill run down his spine as the old woman's gaze settled on Hiroshi. The bloodline of the betrayer must atone for its sins, she continued, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "Hiroshi must make a sacrifice to break the curse and free my spirit." Hiroshi's face went pale, but he nodded slowly, his expression resolute. "I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I will do whatever it takes to set things right." Kazuki and Eiko exchanged a worried glance, but they knew there was no other way. They had come too far to turn back now. The old woman gestured to a small, hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, which Kazuki pried open with trembling hands. Inside, they found a ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming in the dim light. Hiroshi took the dagger, his hands steady despite the gravity of the task ahead. The old woman instructed him to cut his palm and let the blood fall onto the floorboards, symbolizing the atonement of the bloodline. Hiroshi did as she asked, the dagger slicing through his skin with a sharp, painful precision. Blood dripped onto the floor, soaking into the ancient wood. As the blood flowed, the air grew colder, and the oppressive energy seemed to intensify. Kazuki and Eiko watched in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light, and the figure of the old woman began to fade. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a weary relief. "You have freed me from my torment." With those final words, she disappeared, leaving Kazuki, Eiko, and Hiroshi standing in the now silent room. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. Kazuki felt a wave of relief wash over him, and he turned to Eiko, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the morning light. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Eiko nodded, her eyes filled with tears. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious, breaking the curse that had plagued the village for generations. Hiroshi, his hands still bleeding, but his expression serene, turned to Kazuki and Eiko. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You have helped me atone for my family's sins and bring peace to the village." Kazuki and Eiko smiled, their hearts filled with a sense of accomplishment. They had done what many thought impossible, and they had done it together. As they left the old house for the last time, the sun rose over the village, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. The air was filled with the sounds of birds singing, and the village seemed to come alive with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. Kazuki and Eiko knew that their lives would never be the same, but they also knew that they had found a strength within themselves that they never knew existed. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, and they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As they drove away from the village, Kazuki glanced back at the old house one last time, a sense of peace settling over him. The porch light phantom was no more, and the village could finally rest in peace. Their journey had been filled with fear and uncertainty, but they had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. They knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had faced the haunting of the porch light phantom. The village too would move forward, its people carrying the lessons of the past with them, but no longer haunted by the shadows of betrayal and revenge. As they drove into the distance, the sun rose higher in the sky, a symbol of new beginnings and the promise of a brighter future. Kazuki and Eiko held hands, their hearts filled with hope and determination. They had faced the darkness and won, and they knew that they could face anything that came their way. The road ahead was long, but they were ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that they had each other and the strength to overcome any obstacle. The porch light phantom was now a memory, a story that would be told for generations to come. But the fear and the pain had been left behind, replaced by a sense of peace and renewal. Kazuki and Eiko looked forward to the future, knowing that they had faced their fears and emerged victorious, stronger and more united than ever before. The village too would move forward, its people carrying the lessons of the past with them, but no longer haunted by the shadows of betrayal and revenge. The porch light phantom was no more, and the village could finally rest in peace.